On the 31st of October 1905, far from the bright lights of Harlem, he was born in a world where dirt floors were common and dreams were fragile. Long before power, fear, and reputation followed his name, Bumpy Johnson was simply a poor black child growing up in the Deep South, surrounded by violence that felt both random and inevitable. The environment did not offer opportunity. It tested endurance. From the beginning, survival was not a goal. It was a requirement. The early years shaped him in silence. Poverty was not just economic, it was psychological. It taught him that respect had to be taken, not requested. Every day reinforced the same lesson: weakness invited punishment, and hesitation invited loss. The ground beneath his feet was unstable, but his awareness grew sharp. Even as a child, he recognized the imbalance of power around him and understood that systems were designed to favor those who already controlled them. Racial terror defined the atmosphere of his upbringing. Authority did not protect, it threatened. Justice was selective, and fear moved freely. These conditions did more than harden him. They clarified his thinking. He learned that survival required strategy, not hope. Violence existed everywhere, but the ones who truly ruled were not always the loudest. They were calculated, patient, and insulated from consequences. When his family moved north, Harlem did not greet him as a sanctuary. It was louder, faster, and more dangerous in different ways. Opportunity and exploitation lived side by side. Harlem was a crossroads where ambition collided with organized crime, politics, and systemic neglect. The streets operated under rules that were unwritten but strictly enforced. Outsiders rarely understood them, and insiders rarely survived mistakes. Bumpy entered Harlem as an observer. He watched how power circulated. He noticed which men commanded fear without raising their voices. He recognized that money was only one part of control. Reputation and discipline mattered just as much. Harlem was not ruled by chaos. It was ruled by structure. Whoever mastered that structure could bend the streets to their will. Unlike many young men drawn to immediate violence, Bumpy displayed restraint. He studied consequences. He understood that every action created ripples. This patience distinguished him. It allowed him to survive where others burned out quickly. Harlem respected toughness, but it rewarded intelligence even more. Slowly, quietly, he began earning recognition. His physical presence contributed to his legend, but it was not the foundation of his rise. What set him apart was his refusal to be impulsive. He chose calculated responses over emotional reactions. This discipline gave him access. Older figures noticed his composure. Rivals underestimated his depth. Allies sensed reliability. In a city where trust was scarce, consistency became currency. Harlem at the time was under heavy external influence. Powerful criminal organizations from outside the community controlled much of the economy. Black neighborhoods generated profit, but leadership was often denied to black men. This imbalance was obvious to Bumpy. He recognized that Harlem's wealth flowed outward, while its people remained trapped. That realization fueled his ambition. Rather than challenge the system recklessly, he learned how to navigate it. He identified the gatekeepers, the intermediaries, and the true decision-makers. He learned when to comply and when to resist. This adaptability kept him alive and elevated his status. Harlem began to see him not as a reckless enforcer, but as a strategist. As his reputation grew, so did expectations. The streets demanded loyalty. Rivals tested boundaries. External powers monitored his movements. Harlem was watching closely, measuring whether he would conform or disrupt the existing order. With every calculated step, he moved closer to influence that few believed a black man could hold in that era. What began on dirt floors had transformed into something far more dangerous. Bumpy Johnson was no longer just surviving Harlem. He was positioning himself within its power structure. And while many believed Harlem already had its rulers, they failed to see that a new force was quietly consolidating strength. Harlem did not yet understand what was forming in its midst. As Bumpy Johnson's influence expanded, his ambitions began to clash with forces far larger than the neighborhood itself. The next phase of his journey would place him face to face with an empire that never intended to share power, and Harlem would soon become the battleground. Harlem did not reward innocence, and it did not forgive ignorance. The neighborhood functioned on a set of unwritten laws that outsiders rarely understood and insiders rarely explained. Every block carried its own history, every corner its own power dynamic. For a young man trying to rise without being destroyed, learning these rules was not optional. It was survival. Bumpy Johnson entered this environment knowing that one careless move could erase him permanently. He began by staying in the background. Harlem was crowded with ambition, and ambition made people visible. Visibility attracted danger. Bumpy understood that before power could be taken, knowledge had to be earned. He watched who controlled territory without constant violence. He paid attention to which disputes escalated and which were quietly resolved. These patterns revealed the real hierarchy of the streets. What he noticed first was that Harlem was not chaotic. It was regulated. Numbers, runners, gamblers, and underground businesses operated with discipline. Rules existed, and consequences followed those who violated them. Respect mattered more than volume. Reputation mattered more than threats. Those who survived longest were the ones who understood timing and restraint. Bumpy learned that Harlem's economy moved in layers. At street level were the visible hustlers, absorbing the risk and the punishment. Above them were organizers who managed operations and collected profits. At the top were unseen controllers, many of whom lived outside the neighborhood but extracted wealth from it. This structure angered him, but it also educated him. Power, he realized, was often distant and protected. Instead of rebelling against this system immediately, he adapted to it. He positioned himself as reliable. He followed instructions precisely. He avoided unnecessary conflict. This consistency built trust. Older figures began assigning him responsibilities that required discretion rather than force. Each task expanded his understanding of how influence truly worked. Patience became his defining trait. While others chased quick money and short-term recognition, Bumpy focused on longevity. He understood that Harlem remembered mistakes longer than successes. One impulsive act could undo years of careful positioning. This mindset separated him from many of his peers, whose ambition burned fast and ended early. Harlem also tested loyalty constantly. Alliances shifted. Promises were broken. Trust was often exploited. Bumpy learned to evaluate people by actions, not words. He noticed who stayed calm under pressure and who panicked when threatened. These observations helped him choose allies carefully and avoid entanglements that led to betrayal. As his reputation grew, so did scrutiny. Rival crews measured him. Established powers monitored his movements. Harlem began to sense that he was not just another participant in the underground economy. He moved differently. He listened more than he spoke. He calculated before reacting. This unpredictability made him difficult to read and harder to control. He also recognized the importance of image. Harlem respected strength, but it respected intelligence even more when paired with discipline. Bumpy cultivated a presence that suggested capability without recklessness. This balance discouraged challenges while inviting opportunity. People began approaching him not just for enforcement, but for judgment. Despite his growing influence, he remained aware of his limitations. Harlem's power structure was still heavily influenced by outside criminal organizations. Their reach extended into every profitable corner of the neighborhood. Direct confrontation would be suicidal. Bumpy understood that any meaningful rise would require navigating these external forces, not colliding with them blindly. By mastering Harlem's unwritten laws, he had accomplished something rare. He had survived long enough to be considered serious. He had earned enough trust to be included in decisions rather than informed of them. And he had positioned himself close enough to power to see both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. As Bumpy Johnson's understanding of Harlem deepened, one truth became impossible to ignore. The neighborhood's future was being dictated by outsiders. The patience that kept him alive was about to be tested, because the next step in his rise would require dealing with forces that never intended to let Harlem truly belong to itself. Harlem's underground economy was never truly its own. Behind the local faces and familiar streets stood powerful external forces that controlled money, protection, and long-term decisions. By the time Bumpy Johnson reached maturity, This reality was impossible to ignore. Harlem generated enormous wealth, yet most of that wealth flowed outward, controlled by men who neither lived there nor respected the community that sustained them. The numbers racket became the clearest example of this imbalance. It appeared local on the surface, woven into everyday Harlem life, but its upper levels were dominated by white organized crime figures with national reach. They treated Harlem as territory, not as a community. Local operators were allowed to exist only as long as they remained obedient. Any challenge was met with swift retaliation. Bumpy understood that this was not simply about crime, it was about control. Harlem was profitable, disciplined, and densely populated, making it one of the most valuable territories in the country. Yet black leadership was systematically blocked from the top. This exclusion was intentional. Power was centralized elsewhere, and Harlem was expected to comply quietly. Instead of rushing into confrontation, Bumpy studied how these external organizations operated. He observed their reliance on intermediaries. He noticed that their strength depended heavily on fear and reputation, rather than constant enforcement. Most importantly, he realized they underestimated Harlem's internal intelligence. They assumed local figures lacked the discipline to organize independently. Bumpy's role began to change during this period. He was no longer just learning Harlem's rules. He was learning the mafia's expectations. He watched how deals were structured, how disputes were resolved, and how punishments were delivered selectively to maintain order without attracting unnecessary attention from law enforcement. This education was dangerous, but it was invaluable. What set Bumpy apart was his ability to move between worlds. He could speak the language of Harlem's streets while understanding the logic of organized crime. This dual awareness made him useful. External operators saw him as a capable intermediary, someone who could manage local operations efficiently. Harlem residents saw him as one of their own, someone who understood their struggles. This positioning placed him in a morally complex space. He was benefiting from a system that exploited his community, yet he was also gaining access to knowledge and influence that no one else had achieved. He understood that outright resistance would fail. The mafia was too powerful, too entrenched. Any attempt to overthrow them would require patience, leverage, and precise timing. As trust grew, responsibilities followed. Bumpy gained insight into financial flows, protection arrangements, and enforcement strategies. He learned how pressure was applied without violence, and how violence was used sparingly to preserve fear. These lessons shaped his strategic thinking. Power, he learned, was not about constant dominance. It was about selective control. At the same time, resentment simmered beneath the surface. Harlem's people knew who truly benefited from their labor. Quiet frustration spread through the community. Bumpy felt it personally. He recognized that Harlem needed leadership that answered to Harlem, not to distant bosses. This belief became central to his long-term vision. The mafia believed they were managing Harlem. In reality, they were training someone who understood their methods deeply. Bumpy absorbed everything. He memorized patterns, relationships, and vulnerabilities. He learned who relied on whom and where pressure points existed. What looked like cooperation was, in fact, preparation. As his reputation expanded, so did the stakes. He was now operating in a space where mistakes carried fatal consequences. Every move required precision. Harlem watched him carefully, hopeful yet cautious. External powers monitored him, confident he remained within acceptable limits. Both sides believed they understood him. They were wrong. Bumpy Johnson was no longer just navigating the system. He was quietly redefining his place within it. The same mafia figures who believed Harlem was permanently under their control were unknowingly empowering a man who would challenge that assumption. As Bumpy's access to mafia operations deepened, the line between cooperation and confrontation began to blur. Harlem stood on the edge of transformation, and the next phase of Bumpy Johnson's rise would force him to choose between remaining a controlled asset or becoming a threat powerful enough to rewrite Harlem's destiny. Prison was meant to end his momentum. For most men in Harlem's underground, incarceration marked the beginning of irrelevance. Influence faded quickly once freedom was taken away. Operations moved on, loyalties shifted, and names were forgotten. But for Bumpy Johnson, prison did the opposite. It removed distractions and forced reflection. What the system intended as punishment became refinement. Behind bars, power revealed itself in its purest form. There were no street corners, no territories to defend, and no money to flash. Authority was stripped down to influence, reputation, and mental strength. Bumpy entered confinement understanding that survival required a different strategy. Physical dominance was temporary. Psychological control endured. Prison exposed him to a wider criminal ecosystem. Men from different cities, backgrounds, and organizations were confined together. Information traveled faster than protection. Stories replaced transactions. Bumpy listened carefully. He studied how criminal empires expanded, how they collapsed, and how leadership failed. Mistakes were openly discussed in regret-filled whispers. Lessons were free, but only for those disciplined enough to absorb them. Unlike many inmates who hardened emotionally, Bumpy sharpened intellectually. He read extensively, trained his memory, and strengthened his composure. He understood that fear inside prison worked differently than fear on the streets. It was quieter, more psychological, and deeply rooted in reputation. Maintaining calm under pressure elevated his standing. Others noticed his restraint, and restraint earned respect. His time in confinement also reinforced a critical insight. Power outside prison depended on illusion. Power inside prison depended on credibility. Threats meant nothing without follow-through. Words carried weight only when backed by consistency. These principles stayed with him long after release. While locked away, Harlem continued to change. External criminal organizations adjusted their strategies. Leadership gaps emerged. Some figures overreached, others weakened. Bumpy followed these developments through fragments of information passed between inmates and visitors. Even from a cell, he was mapping shifts in power. Distance did not disconnect him from the streets. It clarified them. Prison also tested loyalty. Some alliances dissolved, others strengthened. Bumpy took note of who remained dependable and who disappeared. These observations would later influence how he rebuilt his network. Trust, he learned, was not declared. It was demonstrated over time, especially when circumstances were unfavorable. When release finally approached, anticipation replaced confinement. Bumpy did not rush mentally. He understood that Harlem would not pause for him. The city had continued without waiting. Any attempt to reclaim influence would require patience and recalibration. He was no longer the same man who entered prison. Harlem was no longer the same environment he had left. His absence had created opportunity for others, but it had also exposed instability. Without his steady presence, certain arrangements had weakened. External powers grew more aggressive. Harlem's internal leadership felt fragmented. This imbalance created space for someone capable of restoring order on new terms. Prison had not broken him. It had refined his understanding of power. He emerged more controlled, more strategic, and more aware of long-term consequences. The streets expected a hardened enforcer. What returned was something more dangerous, a leader who had learned patience at the highest cost. As he prepared to step back into Harlem, Bumpy understood that reclaiming influence would require more than reputation. It would require reshaping alliances, redefining boundaries, and confronting forces that had grown comfortable in his absence. Freedom brought opportunity, but it also brought conflict. Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood under pressure. It was a battleground of shifting loyalties and rising tension. As Bumpy Johnson returned, the city faced a question it could no longer avoid. Who truly controlled Harlem now? Returning to Harlem was not a victory lap. It was a recalculation. The neighborhood Bumpy Johnson stepped back into had grown more profitable and more unstable in his absence. External criminal organizations had expanded their grip, exploiting leadership gaps and fractured loyalties. The streets still remembered his name, but memory alone did not guarantee control. Power had to be earned again, this time under far more dangerous conditions. Rather than asserting dominance through force, Bumpy focused on restoring order. He understood that Harlem's underground economy functioned best when rules were consistent and enforcement predictable. Chaos attracted attention, and attention attracted intervention. Violence, when used excessively, weakened control instead of strengthening it. This belief separated him from rivals who relied on fear alone. He began by rebuilding relationships selectively. Old alliances were tested before being revived. New partnerships were formed cautiously. Bumpy prioritized reliability over enthusiasm. He identified individuals capable of managing operations quietly and efficiently. These choices stabilized income streams and reduced unnecessary conflict. Harlem's streets slowly sensed a shift toward discipline. One of his most significant moves was restructuring how profits flowed. Instead of allowing wealth to be extracted entirely by external powers, Bumpy negotiated arrangements that retained more resources within the community. This was not framed as rebellion. It was framed as efficiency. Operations ran smoother, collections improved, and disruptions decreased. These results made resistance difficult to justify. External criminal figures noticed the changes. Harlem was becoming more self-regulated. Enforcement incidents declined, and revenue remained strong. On the surface, it appeared beneficial, but beneath that stability was a growing concern. Bumpy's influence was no longer limited to enforcement or mediation. He was shaping policy. That level of control had never been intended for him. What made Bumpy dangerous was not aggression, but legitimacy. Harlem increasingly viewed him as a stabilizing force rather than a threat. Community members benefited from reduced chaos. Local operators respected the clarity of his rules. This support insulated him. Any move against him risked destabilizing an area that had become highly profitable and relatively quiet. He also mastered the art of negotiation. Rather than issuing ultimatums, he presented outcomes. He spoke in terms of mutual benefit, framing his control as protection against disorder. This approach reduced resistance and delayed confrontation. Opposing forces struggled to justify action against a man who appeared to be improving conditions. Despite this progress, tension remained. External organizations were not accustomed to sharing influence. They tolerated Bumpy's leadership as long as it served their interests. But tolerance was temporary. Behind closed doors, discussions began. His growing autonomy was being evaluated, measured, and questioned. Bumpy was aware of this scrutiny. He adjusted his strategy accordingly. He avoided sudden expansions. He limited displays of power. Every move was calculated to appear necessary rather than ambitious. This restraint bought time, but it also increased expectations. Harlem's future was now tied to his leadership. As his position strengthened, so did the risk. The balance he maintained was fragile. One misstep could trigger retaliation from forces far larger than Harlem. Yet doing nothing would eventually produce the same result. Power, once demonstrated, could not be hidden indefinitely. Bumpy had succeeded in reclaiming Harlem without igniting open war, but success had consequences. The more order he created, the more visible his influence became. And visibility was dangerous. Harlem was calmer, more profitable, and more unified than it had been in years. But that stability raised an unavoidable question among outside powers. Was Bumpy Johnson still an asset, or had he become a rival whose control threatened the entire balance of organized crime in New York? At a certain level of power, violence stops being useful. It becomes expensive, unpredictable, and counterproductive. This was the stage Bumpy Johnson had reached. Harlem was under his influence, but the city surrounding it was dominated by far larger criminal empires. These organizations had national reach, political insulation, and decades of experience eliminating threats. Direct confrontation would not be survival. It would be suicide. Bumpy understood that the American mafia did not fear strength alone. They feared disruption. Anything that threatened profit stability or attracted law enforcement attention became a liability. His strategy shifted accordingly. Instead of presenting himself as a challenger, he positioned himself as a solution. Harlem, under his leadership, had become quieter, more profitable, and easier to manage. Negotiations with mafia intermediaries were not dramatic displays of dominance. They were calculated exchanges built on leverage and restraint. Bumpy never framed his authority as ownership. He framed it as stewardship. Harlem ran efficiently because it was locally managed. Interference he argued, would destabilize operations that were already working. The mafia evaluated him carefully. Historically, black leadership was tolerated only at lower levels. Control was expected to remain external. But Bumpy's situation was different. Removing him would require force. Force would create chaos. Chaos would invite scrutiny. Scrutiny was bad for business. This reality gave Bumpy negotiating power that few expected him to have. What made him especially dangerous in these negotiations was his preparation. He understood their structures, their profit models, and their internal politics. He knew when to speak and when to remain silent. He did not threaten. He presented outcomes. Cooperation meant stability. Interference meant disruption. The choice was framed as practical, not personal. The mafia respected efficiency. Harlem, under Bumpy, delivered consistent revenue with minimal conflict. That fact outweighed tradition and prejudice. Reluctantly, arrangements were adjusted. Bumpy was allowed more autonomy than any black leader before him, not because he was trusted, but because he was effective. However, this autonomy came with constant surveillance. Every decision he made was monitored. Any sign of overreach would be addressed swiftly. Bumpy accepted these conditions. He understood that freedom within organized crime was always conditional. The goal was not independence. It was endurance. Harlem benefited from this uneasy balance. External enforcement decreased. Local leadership solidified. Community-level order improved. But beneath the surface, tension remained. The mafia did not forget challenges to hierarchy. They tolerated them until circumstances changed. Bumpy remained cautious. He avoided expansion beyond Harlem. He limited displays of wealth. He kept operations disciplined. These choices were intentional. They signaled restraint. Restraint delayed retaliation. Yet, even with restraint, his existence disrupted expectations. A black man operating as an equal negotiator unsettled deeply ingrained assumptions. The mafia accepted the arrangement, but acceptance was not approval. It was temporary convenience. Bumpy knew this. He did not mistake tolerance for safety. Every day, his position depended on maintaining value without appearing indispensable. Too weak, and he would be replaced. Too strong, and he would be removed. He walked that line carefully, aware that the margin for error was thin. Harlem stood stable, but stability itself was becoming a provocation. The deals had been made, and Harlem remained under Bumpy Johnson's control for now. But organized crime never allowed exceptions to last forever. As outside powers reassessed the balance of control, the question shifted from negotiation to elimination. And Bumpy's greatest test was still ahead. Power isolated most men who reached the top. It separated them from the people who made their rise possible. Bumpy Johnson followed a different path. While his authority extended through Harlem's underground economy, his influence also moved through the community itself. This dual presence strengthened his position in ways violence never could. Harlem residents experienced tangible changes under his control. Disorder decreased. Arbitrary enforcement faded. Local disputes were resolved quickly and quietly. While his power was rooted in crime, its expression produced stability. This outcome mattered to a community accustomed to unpredictability and neglect. Bumpy became associated with order rather than chaos. Loyalty did not come from fear alone. It came from consistency. People knew what to expect from him. Rules were enforced evenly. Favoritism was limited. Those who operated within boundaries were protected. Those who crossed lines faced consequences. This predictability created trust in an environment where trust was rare. He also understood symbolism. His presence in Harlem was visible but not excessive. He did not isolate himself behind walls or distance. He remained accessible, aware that perception shaped authority. Harlem saw him not as an outsider extracting value, but as someone embedded in the neighborhood's reality. This connection gave him protection beyond enforcement. Community support acted as a buffer. External forces hesitated to disrupt a structure that appeared locally accepted. Removing him risked destabilizing a neighborhood that had grown quieter and more productive. That risk carried consequences beyond criminal politics. At the same time, Bumpy maintained discipline. He discouraged reckless behavior among his associates. He prioritized discretion. He understood that community tolerance was conditional. Too much attention would erode goodwill. Balance was essential. Control without restraint invited collapse. His leadership style contrasted sharply with external powers. Where they relied on intimidation, he relied on structure. Where they extracted profit without regard for impact, he reinvested selectively. This difference strengthened his legitimacy. Harlem increasingly viewed him as its own authority rather than an imposed one. However, this loyalty also created pressure. Expectations grew. Harlem depended on him for stability. Any sign of weakness could unravel trust. Rivals watched closely. External organizations monitored shifts in public sentiment. Bumpy's position was strong, but it was not permanent. The civil rights era introduced additional complexity. Harlem's awareness of power, race, and self-determination increased. Bumpy existed at the intersection of these forces. He was not a political leader, but his influence carried political implications. His presence challenged assumptions about who could hold authority. This period tested his adaptability. He adjusted strategies to maintain relevance without provoking confrontation. He avoided public displays that could be interpreted as defiance. Quiet control remained his priority. Harlem's stability depended on it. Yet beneath the surface, tension grew. The more deeply he was woven into Harlem's identity, the harder it would be to remove him without consequences. External powers recognized this risk. So did law enforcement. His position was becoming too entrenched to ignore. Bumpy had become more than a power broker. He had become a symbol. Symbols attract attention, and attention invites challenge. As Harlem's loyalty to Bumpy Johnson deepened, so did the pressure on those who wanted him gone. His strength was no longer just operational, it was cultural. And that made the next confrontation unavoidable, because forces beyond Harlem were preparing to break what could no longer be quietly controlled. Every system that grows powerful eventually attracts the attention of a larger one. For Bumpy Johnson, that system was the state itself. What organized crime tolerated for profit, law enforcement could not ignore indefinitely. Harlem's unusual stability, its disciplined underground economy, and its unusually centralized leadership raised questions that could no longer be dismissed. Government attention did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly. Surveillance increased. Patterns were analyzed. Associations were mapped. Rather than targeting chaos, authorities focused on consistency. Harlem was too orderly, too controlled, and too insulated from internal conflict. These were indicators not of peace, but of command. Bumpy understood this shift immediately. Law enforcement pressure operated differently from criminal pressure. There were no negotiations, no informal understandings, and no shared incentives. The state did not need Harlem's money. It needed results. This changed the calculus entirely. He adjusted by narrowing operations. Exposure was reduced. Layers of insulation increased. Associates were compartmentalized. Communication became indirect. These measures slowed momentum but preserved structure. The goal was no longer expansion or dominance. It was survival. Despite these efforts, pressure intensified. Investigations overlapped. Federal and local authorities coordinated. Harlem became a monitored environment. Routine actions carried risk. Even minor missteps could trigger consequences. The margin for error shrank daily. This period marked the beginning of decline, not in influence, but in freedom. Bumpy still commanded respect. His authority remained intact, but movement became constrained. Decisions took longer. Opportunities narrowed. The very discipline that once protected him now made his organization predictable to outside analysts. Age also played a role. The physical demands of leadership weighed heavier. The constant vigilance required to stay ahead of both rivals and authorities drained energy. Harlem had evolved, and so had the world around it. New laws, new tactics, and new political priorities reshaped enforcement strategies. Bumpy recognized that power was no longer something he could expand. It was something he had to defend. This defensive posture changed the rhythm of his leadership. Risk avoidance replaced ambition. Stability replaced growth. Harlem sensed the shift. Operations continued, but urgency faded. The future felt uncertain. Younger figures watched closely, wondering whether the structure he built could outlive him. External powers recalculated their positions. Law enforcement intensified its focus. The system was tightening, not with force, but with persistence. As surveillance closed in and options narrowed, Bumpy Johnson faced an unavoidable truth. Every reign has an endpoint. The only question left was whether his legacy would collapse under pressure or endure beyond his control. Power rarely ends with noise. More often, it fades quietly, leaving confusion in its place. When Bumpy Johnson reached the final chapter of his life, there was no dramatic collapse of his empire, no public defeat that signaled the end. What followed instead was something far more telling, a vacuum that exposed just how much of Harlem's balance had depended on him. His death did not immediately change the streets. Operations continued. Money still moved. Familiar faces still held positions, but beneath the surface, instability began to grow. The structure he had built was disciplined, but it was also personal. Much of its cohesion came from his judgment, his restraint, and his ability to mediate conflict before it escalated. Without him, decision-making slowed. Disputes that would once have been quietly resolved began to linger. Small disagreements carried greater risk. Harlem's underground economy was still functional, but it had lost its center of gravity. Leadership existed, but authority was fragmented. The community felt the shift almost immediately. Bumpy had represented predictability in an unpredictable environment. His presence discouraged reckless behavior, not just among criminal operators, but across the neighborhood. With that presence gone, uncertainty returned. People waited to see who would fill the gap, or whether anyone could. External criminal organizations recognized the opportunity. Harlem had always been valuable, but now it was vulnerable. The restraint that once defined its operations weakened. New figures tested boundaries. Outside influence crept back in, subtle at first, then more assertive. The balance Bumpy maintained through negotiation began to erode. Law enforcement also adjusted. With centralized control gone, fragmentation created openings. Investigations expanded. Pressure increased. The system that had survived through discipline now struggled with inconsistency. Mistakes multiplied. Attention followed. For Harlem, the loss was not just operational, it was symbolic. Bumpy had represented a rare phenomenon, a local authority who understood both the streets and the forces beyond them. His absence reminded everyone how unusual that balance had been. Many had benefited from it without realizing how fragile it was. Those who attempted to replace him faced impossible expectations. They inherited power without legitimacy, authority without trust, control without consensus. Harlem did not accept new leadership easily. Loyalty that had been earned over decades could not be transferred overnight. As time passed, the consequences became clearer. Violence increased incrementally. Disorder returned in pockets. External powers regained influence. The neighborhood's underground economy became louder, less disciplined, and more exposed. The era of quiet control was ending. Bumpy Johnson's death did not destroy Harlem, but it removed a stabilizing force that had kept competing pressures in check. What followed was not immediate chaos, but gradual unraveling, the kind that only becomes obvious once the damage is done. His absence answered a question many had quietly asked. What held Harlem together was not just structure or fear, it was leadership grounded in understanding, restraint, and long-term thinking. Without that, systems reverted to instinct. As Harlem adjusted to life without Bumpy Johnson, a final question emerged: was his rise an exception shaped by history, or a blueprint that could never be repeated? The answer would define how his story would be remembered, long after the streets moved on. History often remembers power in extremes, heroes or villains, victories or defeats. The life of Bumpy Johnson resists that simplicity. His story does not fit neatly into moral categories. It exists in the complicated space where survival, intelligence, and circumstance intersect. To understand his legacy is not to celebrate it, but to examine what it reveals about power, race, and control in America. Bumpy's rise from dirt floors to Harlem's throne was not fueled by chaos, but by structure. In an environment designed to exclude black leadership, he navigated systems that were never meant to accommodate him. He did not overturn those systems. He learned them, exploited their blind spots, and carved out space within them. That distinction matters. His leadership demonstrated that dominance was not the only path to control. Discipline, predictability, and restraint proved more effective than constant violence. Harlem, under his influence, was quieter, more organized, and more profitable than many comparable territories. These outcomes forced even his adversaries to acknowledge his effectiveness. At the same time, his story exposes uncomfortable truths. Harlem's stability existed within a criminal framework. Order was achieved through illegal means because legal systems had failed to provide protection, opportunity, or representation. Bumpy filled a vacuum created by systemic neglect. That vacuum should never have existed. His negotiations with powerful criminal organizations challenged assumptions about who could hold authority. Yet those negotiations also underscored the limits imposed on black leadership. Autonomy was conditional. Acceptance was temporary. His success was tolerated only as long as it served external interests. After his death, Harlem's gradual unraveling revealed how much balance depended on individual judgment rather than institutional strength. That fragility is the central lesson of his legacy. Systems built around personalities collapse when those personalities disappear. Bumpy Johnson's story is not a blueprint to follow. It is a case study. It shows how intelligence can overcome barriers temporarily, but not eliminate them. It reveals how power adapts rather than disappears. And it demonstrates how communities respond when leadership emerges from within rather than being imposed from outside. His life also forces a deeper question. When legitimate systems fail, what replaces them? And who decides the cost of that replacement? Bumpy did not create the conditions that made his rise possible. He responded to them. That response shaped Harlem for decades. Today, his name remains tied to Harlem's history, not because of fear, but because of impact. He represented control in a time of neglect, structure in a time of disorder. Whether that legacy is viewed as necessary or tragic depends on perspective. What cannot be denied is this: his rise was not accidental. It was calculated, patient, and deeply informed by the realities of his environment. From dirt floors to Harlem's throne, Bumpy Johnson's life tells a story about America itself, who it empowers, who it excludes, and what happens in the space between. The streets moved on, but the questions his life raised remain unanswered. And as long as systems continue to fail the communities they claim to serve, stories like Bumpy Johnson's will continue to emerge, different faces, different eras, but the same unresolved struggle for control and dignity.